Very pleased to be welcoming to the show the Honorable Marlin Stutzman. He is a U.S. Representative for Indiana's 3rd Congressional District. We're going to be talking about the government shutdown that just ended, what's next, and Representative Stutzman has a new housing bill that he wants to talk to us about. Welcome to the show. Very honored to be hosting you, Representative Stutzman. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Great to be with you. Appreciate you having me on today.
Let's talk about this government shutdown, 43-day disruption, the longest in American history. The legislation that was reached today was a result of 8 senators who broke ranks with the Democrats after reaching the conclusion that Republicans would not bend on using a government funding bill to extend the healthcare tax credits. The package includes a $203.5 million package to boost security for lawmakers and an additional $28 million for the security of Supreme Court justices. Before we get into the details of the package that President Trump signed earlier this week, just tell us, Representative Stutzman, why did this shutdown take so long this time?
Yeah, a great question. It was one of the most unnecessary shutdowns that ever needed to happen in U.S. history. And of course, Senate Democrats decided that they're going to just simply call a timeout. They're going to play politics with the American people in the economy. The fact is that House Republicans, we don't have a filibuster rule in the House of Representatives. We just simply have to have 50% plus 1 to be able to pass a bill. We had a simple majority. We passed the clean CR, which has been done many times by both Republicans and Democrats. And so it goes over to the Senate, and the Senate has a different rule that allows for the Democrats to hold up, or a minority of senators to hold up a bill from going to the floor, and that's the filibuster rule. And many of us think of the filibuster rule as Mr. Smith goes to Washington, he goes to the floor, he reads out of the phone book, he reads out of the Bible, or whatever. He reads, he keeps the talking on the floor. Well, this rule has been around for good purposes, actually, when it first started, and it was simply to make sure that the debate was done, that every senator had the ability to speak on an issue. And then they would vote and say, okay, are we all done? And then they would go to final passage. It started out at 75 at one point historically, then it got reduced down to 60. So you have to have 60 senators that say, okay, we're all done discussing the bill. Let's go to final passage. Well, now what they're doing is instead of going to the floor and filibustering, they're just simply saying, we're not going to give you 60 votes to go to final passage. And that's how Democrats can control the floor of the Senate rather than the majority party, which is the Republicans now, because we only have 53 senators. And we were getting 3 Democrats on the other side, a couple of Democrats and an independent that were voting with Republicans. So we had 56 senators voting to get to the final bill. And we needed, of course, 4 more. We finally got over that threshold. But it was 43 days of a shutdown that didn't need to take place. All of the disruptions on air travel, of course, small business loans, you had food stamps, and the SNAP program was not funded. For my area, we produce a lot of medical devices, orthopedics. Those 510Ks were all sitting on desks in Washington. Tax returns or tax refunds were sitting on desks in Washington. And so it completely unnecessary, but Democrats wanted to hold out for funding for illegals, healthcare benefits, and then also for the subsidies for Obamacare, which we're still subsidizing. And it's just shown again that Obamacare has been a failure. So a lot of things going on here. But, what's just remarkable, David, is that the Democrat Party was willing to put the American people through this and use us as leverage to try to accomplish their agenda in the Senate, which just wasn't going to happen.
According to this PBS article, 1.25 million federal workers were affected in this shutdown in the last 40-something days. About $16 billion in wages were missed. Do we have a guarantee that there will be back pay for these 1.25 million people affected?
As far as I know, and that was the one thing that Democrats did get in the bill that did pass, was that even the federal employees that were riffed by the Trump administration got their jobs back and with back pay. And so, again, to me, it's ironic that the Democrat Party fights for the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., but they don't fight for the teacher and the farmer out in the heartland across America by making sure that we find a solution to keep healthcare costs low. And they want to subsidize the big insurance companies. I think we should send any sort of subsidy or assistance for these skyrocketing premiums to go straight to the American people. So, the Trump administration even gave bonuses to the folks at the airports that are doing security. They're making sure that those who showed up for work were getting a bonus, because they really were the TSA agents that were really put under a lot of pressure, and those government officials that showed up deserve our thanks, because they were at least willing to do the job in spite of the fact that Senate Democrats shut the government down and they didn't get their paychecks.
Representative Stutzman, we have here an estimate from the Congressional Budget Office as to the effects of the shutdown on the economy. So the CBO was asked for information about the effects on the economy of the lapse in discretionary appropriations, often called a government shutdown. Importantly, it says here, after the shutdown, real GDP will be temporarily higher than it would have been otherwise, although most of the decline in real GDP will be recovered eventually. CBO estimates that between $7 billion and $14 billion in 2025 dollar terms will not be. Can you just comment on the effects cited here? They seem like pretty big numbers, and ultimately what can be done to offset some of these losses here?
Yeah, it's unfortunate. It's really a snag that was forced on the economy that didn't need to happen. And I'm sure what Democrats want more than anything else is they just want to be sure that there's some sort of glitch for President Trump. The fact is Trump derangement syndrome is real. This is something that needs to stop. There needs to be bipartisan work together. Like I said, in the past, there have been CRs that both Republicans and Democrats have supported to move the ball forward so we could negotiate different differences rather than just shutting the government down. And so, my hope is that with the policies that have been put in place on tax, that the trade policies that President Trump has been working on so hard and resetting the table on our trade policy, and of course, finally interest rates are coming down a bit, will help create some velocity in the economy. As I talked to a lot of business owners, I actually had a round table this morning with the LaGrange Chamber of Commerce in my home county, and heard from a lot of folks in agriculture, manufacturing, logistics, and transportation, and many of them are saying that it's been a solid year, but they're really hoping that to grow out of what happened over the past several years of inflationary costs rising, and of course the regulatory burden that a lot of people have had to deal with. So they're all optimistic that 2026 can be a strong economic year. And my hope is that we've done all those pieces on policy. Now moving forward into fiscal year 26, that we'll see a very strong economy, and there are good signals that's happening.
It's been speculated that some of the furloughed employees from the government may seek employment in the private sector. Do you think that the government is taking this as an opportune time to evaluate whether or not everybody in the federal government needs to have a job? In other words, reevaluate the workforce size, as was the initial proposal laid out by DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency?
Yeah, well, I'm a business owner. Have done mergers and acquisitions, turnaround, startups, and at any point, it's good for businesses to look at are we efficient? Do we have employees that are maybe outdated or aren't fulfilling the role of the mission of the company? And that's where I think that all of us as people have a responsibility to be productive and to be honest and make sure that we're maximized to our fullest capability. And it's easy in government. Government, it's very different than the private sector because, it's basically you open up the purse and tell the taxpayer how much money you need to be able to pay the bills. And then all of a sudden, you keep taxing and, this agency's in place and there's overlap between agencies. And, we're seeing this even with this housing bill that we're going to be talking about, that there's multiple agencies that do the same thing in maybe just a different way. And so I think, having a businessman like President Trump and Scott Bessent and the leadership that we have with, of course, Vice President J.D. Vance, with those same principles. And what DOGE did is making sure that our federal government is efficient. There were so many findings that we should all be shaking our head at, that the federal government is just simply taking our tax dollars and sending it into to contracts or to sending it to vendors that weren't even applicable anymore, and that those contracts should have expired a long time ago or shouldn't have been renewed. But the government's pretty big, and so it's going to take a lot of work.
Can you comment on SNAP? So 42 million Americans currently are on food assistance. As of a couple of weeks ago, there was rumors or speculation or worries that that may end. So the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, known as SNAP, is set to end in November due to the shutdown. Obviously, the shutdown is no longer applicable. Is this coming back?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's that's what a CR is, a continuing resolution. It continues all of the funding that has already been in place prior to the shutdown, and so these programs are going to restart. It's going to take some time, of course, because of the glitch of the shutdown.
What do you think of Trump's $2,000 tariff dividend plan?
I'm open to listening to what his ideas are. I know that there has been volatility from the tariff negotiations. Of course, I know the American farmers have seen that, whether it's on beef prices or whether it's on soybean prices. There's been some issues, but honestly, David, we have $37 trillion of debt. We're paying $1 trillion in debt service on that debt annually. I would like to see any sort of surpluses used towards debt reduction. It'll actually, benefit us as the American people in the long run. A lot of folks, and I get it, I understand and sympathize because I come from a farm family and part of a farm family in Indiana, and it has been difficult because of the commodity prices. But at the same time, balance sheets on farmers' balance sheets, those have been pushed up because of inflation. So cash is tight this year. But as we always said on the farm, we're always asset rich, cash flow poor. We want to make sure that farmers don't have to go out of business for the circumstances that have happened. But I think that if there's any way that we can put money towards our debt, that's what we should do.
And also money towards making housing more affordable is the slogan of both the Democrats and the Republicans. They have different ways of going about it. You recently introduced a Rural Housing Act. So I'm just going to read a couple sentences from this this proposal here. Congressman Marlin Stutzman, Congresswoman Brittany Peterson, Congresswoman Lisa McClain, and Congressman David Scott introduced the Streamlining Rural Housing Act, which directs the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to enter a memorandum of understanding to align housing standards. Tell us about this.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's pretty straightforward, David. Again, it's one of those situations where you have two different federal agencies with rules. And, as I talk to home builders and folks that work in rural housing, where there's a real need. I mean, there's a real need for housing across the country. But the fact that you have two different standards by two different agencies can cause disruptions. And people are saying, well, which one should we follow? And so what our bill does is it just simply streamlines that and make sure that there's uniform standards between those agencies and that there's some sort of communication between those agencies for so that this doesn't happen again. And that way, we're not delaying a building project. We're not delaying those who are wanting to build a housing project, and that there's more of a one-stop shop rather than having to bounce around to the different agencies.
It says here this bill requires the HUD and USDA to evaluate the feasibility of a joint environmental review and inspection process for these projects, making affordable rural housing easier to build and cutting burdensome government red tape. Yeah. Can you just elaborate on that? So what is this red tape that needs to be streamlined here exactly?
Well, I mean, whether it's permitting processes, whether it's environmental, of course, here in the heartland, we have a lot of lakes and rivers. And, of course, with agriculture and zoning issues, you want to make sure that, we put our building projects in the right place, that it's going to be a solid foundation for those. And so we want to make sure that those rules are all followed. But when you have rules at HUD, then you have rules at USDA, and you're trying to match those up. Sometimes they don't work together. And that's simply what we're trying to get to, is that the permits that our building departments in our counties have to follow, the rules and guidelines that they have to follow. Typically, environmental laws is usually what affects them the most, but that there's a streamlining between those agencies, and that we're singing off of one song sheet rather than multiple song sheets.
It says here a statement from Representative Scott: rural housing construction has been facing a significant drop due to rising construction costs, labor shortages, and limited access to financing. What have been the consequences of these developments, if that's true?
Yeah, no, I mean, it is true. I mean, I've seen it, where, of course, it's a tough business. I mean, whether that's where a lot of jobs, I mean, we're not seeing the skilled labor coming out of our high schools like we used to. We really need to focus in our education system on the skilled labor, the welders, the builders, the truck drivers. We're seeing this real problem now that even the truckers are having. There's states that are pushing licenses, CDLs, to drivers who aren't qualified. And so instead of just focusing strictly on 4-year degrees, we should also be focusing on certifications and skills training in our high schools and colleges to make sure we have that skilled labor. Those guys out there, I mean, my nephews, they're plumbing and drilling wells. My boys are working on the farm. I mean, that's hard work, but there is some skill training that needs to be done. So that's what we're trying to drive at, is reduce that the red tape that can drive cost up. Because if you want to pay more in wages to those construction workers, you got to make it an affordable project, so that way the home buyer can afford the home, and then the home builder can actually pay wages to the hardworking people that actually build the home.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like your overall agenda here is to make it easier for developers to build in these areas, thereby increasing the supply. The other approach or ideology, I guess, is to have the governments directly fund affordable housing projects, which is a different approach altogether. Can you evaluate the differences here? Ultimately, which one you align with more?
I mean, I always align with free markets. I think that, home ownership is it's a beautiful thing. I mean, the American dream is to own your own home, to own your own car, to be able to take your family on vacation. But what we're seeing, because of more regulation throughout the federal government, and we see certain state governments, California, of course, is a high regulatory state, and businesses are leaving, whether they're going to Texas, they're coming to Indiana from the Chicago area. They're going to states like Tennessee and Florida, places that they have less regulation, because regulation is that hidden tax. It's a blanket on the economy when people have to constantly. I mean, I'm in the food industry, and we had within our food products, we had a label that we were just simply trying to get approved by the USDA. It took us 9 months to get a beef stick USDA a label approved by the USDA. Think of that. That's 9 months of delay of projects that could be working, where we could be paying people and producing products that could be sold. I'm not saying that all regulations should be thrown out, but it's the speed at which the federal government works at that often delays our economy and our businesses. And time is money, and that's why it's important for us to have an efficient government that works as quickly as possible, making sure that the regulations don't stand in the way of progress.
Well, what do you think of government efforts to make housing more affordable through direct government intervention? Rent freezes, for example. Are you in support of rent freezes?
No, sir.
No, they don't work? Why not?
Again, you're manipulating the market. Whether it's I mean, I've opposed farm subsidies for a long time. I mean, when the government gives us farmers a direct subsidy, it's supposed to go to the producer, but oftentimes the landowner says, hey, you know what? I know you're getting an increase in subsidies from the federal government, therefore my rent is going to go up. And so you're just driving the prices up. When people know there's money, free money, that they like to say that it is coming from the government, somebody's going to have to pay for that.
We have a few minutes left, Representative Stutzman. Let's talk about crypto legislation. As you're aware, over the summer, a few landmark pieces of legislations were passed. I'm talking about the Genius Act and then later the Clarity Act for market structure. Where is the current environment for legislation around crypto heading from here?
Well, I mean, the Congress is very interested, of course, with cryptocurrency. I remember our very first hearing back in 2014 in our subcommittee on financial services, where we were trying to get our heads wrapped around on what this is and how it works, and what role should the government play. And but over time, this has become, of course, mainstream. It can be very volatile, and I think that my big concern with cryptocurrency and coin productions is just a pump and dump scheme. Because I think that that's where people can really be taken advantage of. And so I think it's important for us to have some parameters, disclosures. I mean, we don't want to drive the industry into more red tape and almost so difficult to do anything. But it's going to be interesting to see how crypto plays out over the next several years. And but it's a very effective tool. It's a useful tool. But obviously, we want to make sure that those people who invest or utilize cryptocurrency, there are some protection and guide rails to that. One of the things, too, we also feel that it's important is that America lead on cryptocurrency policy and not the Chinese government or the Russian government. We want to make sure that America is leading. That way, there's character and integrity built into those guidelines, as well as protections on both sides for individuals as they utilize it.
The issuance of stablecoins, can that be used to fix our debt problem that you alluded to earlier? The Russians accused the U.S. of using the Genius Act as a pathway to issue stablecoins to erase government debt. Anyway, how do you respond to that?
I think that as we look to those who utilize cryptocurrency, there's still a very free market trait to that. And I think if people feel like it's being abused by a particular government, there's going to be a reaction to that. So I like cryptocurrency. I mean, it is a free market. It's one of those, it's something that could be utilized quickly on transactions. It's also can be seen as an investment. But I think the more that government does get involved, and that's why we wanted to make sure that the U.S. federal government maintained a distance and didn't get too heavily involved to where it's going to suffocate a very useful tool.
Okay, we'll end it here. Thank you very much. We'll be happy to have you back on and talk more about all of these issues as they develop, and the funding for the new bill. We have a new shutdown apparently in the works. Potentially in January. So much has to happen between now and January. We'll follow up then. Thank you very much, Representative Stutzman. Where can we follow you and your work right now?
Yeah, we're on all the platforms, and we kept the name uniform across all platforms. It's at Rep Stutzman. Of course, love people to follow along and see what we're up to. And of course, always engage in the conversation.
Follow the links down below. Thank you very much. Representative Stutzman, we'll speak again soon. Take care for now.
Thank you, David.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.